Hey everybody! So today's video will be a bit of kind of a sensitive subject because nobody likes to talk about it, but it's still a very important topic. We're going to be talking about how to plan for and prevent emergencies. Honestly, a fire is my biggest fear as a reptile owner. There's a lot of electronics involved between heat mats and thermostats and heat lights and UVB lights and just all these electronics that can possibly cause a fire that we need to be prepared for if that were to happen. So today we're going to talk about how you can prevent an emergency or a disaster from happening in your home as best as you can, and we're going to talk about if an emergency does occur, like even a natural disaster like a hurricane or a flood or something. We're going to talk about how you can be best prepared by not only having the right plan, but also having a grab-and-go reptile supply and travel bin. First, let's talk about preventing disasters, since there's a lot you can do to prevent these things from happening in your reptile home. First and foremost, when it comes to preventing disasters at your house, make sure you have electronics hooked up correctly. If you are using a heat mat, make sure you're using a thermostat with it to regulate its temperature. That not only makes it safer for your reptile, but it also helps prevent fires. If you use heat tape like in a rack system, make sure you have the heat tape installed correctly, including all of the insulation around the wires that's necessary. And even if you have it set up correctly, make sure you check it often. Whether it's a heat mat, check underneath, make sure it's not burning the surface below it for some odd reason. If you have heat tape, make sure you check it, because over time, it often will start melting. It'll start going bad. This is just what happens. We came across this on a used rack we bought off Craigslist, and we noticed that the heat tape is just destroyed on one of the layers. So we just removed this entire strip and we're gonna replace that. Another good idea is to not overload your outlets on the wall and instead use a surge protector so that there is proper insulation and protection there. Better yet, you can use a battery backup, so if you do have an electrical outage, that backup will have already charged itself and can kind of take over the power to your reptile enclosures until the power of your house comes back on. But you do have to make sure that that battery backup will last long enough, so check the size of it before you buy. If you use heat lamps, then just be smart about where you place them. Not only do you want them to be secure on the enclosure, there's halogen lamps that come with clamps to keep them clipped to screen tops, but if the lamp doesn't have those clips and you have to pick it up and rest it somewhere else to get inside the enclosure, don't put it somewhere else when it's still on. A friend of ours did that with one of our basking lamps one day, and we started smelling this burning smell, and we caught that in time before it went up in flames, but now we have this lovely black hole of a scar on our window frame to remind us never to do that again, or just to never trust our friend with that heat lamp again, honestly. You also want to be smart about what types of enclosures you're using with heat lamps. I mean, you don't want to put a heat lamp on top of a plastic lid. It could melt. We see this quite often with turtle tanks around the trim of the tank, where that plastic just gets too hot and literally starts melting. You also want to be careful with heat lamps around wooden enclosures for obvious reasons. And lastly, it's a good idea to have fire extinguishers nearby. We recommend having one on at least every level of the house, if not every room of the house, if that's possible. They come in different sizes and shapes, and there's different ways to use them, so whichever one you end up getting, we have a few different styles around our house in areas that both Ed and I are familiar with in case we need to use them, but no matter which one you end up getting, make sure you know how to use it properly too. Read the instructions and familiarize yourself with how to use it properly in case you need to. By the way, I'll put links to all these products in the description below in case you need to pick anything up. Okay, so now we've reviewed different ways you can prevent a fire from happening in your house. Well, what if something else happens and you need to act fast? Well, we're going to talk first about what to do if something somewhat mild happens, like a power outage, and then we're going to talk about if you have to evacuate your house, how you should be prepared for that. So first, let's start with a power outage. If you have a power outage in your house for an extended period of time, first, keep in mind that temperatures fluctuate in the wild anyway for all species of reptiles. So if your temperature rises or drops like 10 degrees, 15, 20 degrees in the reptile's enclosure. Depending on what its normal temperature is at, it might be just fine. But it's for those extremely prolonged cases where if it's very hot or very cold outside, then you should be prepared and you should have something ready to go to make your reptile more comfortable. So if your power goes out for a short amount of time, chances are you'll be just fine. But if it's out for a longer period of time, then you might have to take some action. If you live in a very hot climate and your power goes out for an extended period of time, then make sure your reptile's habitat is not in the sunlight. This might seem obvious, but it might get overlooked in the panic of a power outage. If you need to, you can even move that enclosure to the lowest level of the house where it should be naturally coolest. If you need to go even further than that, then you can lightly mist your reptile with cool water. If you live in a very cold climate and the power goes out, then you can use water in a similar way. Just have a warm, not too hot, but a warm water bottle next to the reptile so they can stay warm against it. You can also move that enclosure up to the warmest room of the house to keep it warm. Or you can hold your reptile against your body to keep it warm using your own body heat. And another idea you can try is using a heat pack used for shipping reptiles. You don't want to use something like hot hands because these get way too hot for reptiles. You want something with more of a reasonable regulated temperature. And these last, I think, up to 40 plus hours. So you can use these for quite a while. They're not just for shipping reptiles. These are great to have on hand in case of emergency. Now, just like a regular heat mat, keep this outside of the enclosure. Don't place your reptile directly on one of these. And if all else fails, have somebody that you can bring your reptiles to with power in their house to keep your reptiles comfortable until the power in your house is back on again. Now, what's probably worse than a power outage is a scenario where you have to evacuate your house. And this is a really tough one to discuss because, I mean, we're literally talking about life and death here. Sometimes you have warning and sometimes you don't have any warning at all. Your safety comes first. Make sure that you are safe, obviously. Get yourself out of the house. If you don't have time to grab your reptiles, then, I mean, I hate to say it, but you have to save yourself first. But if you do have time, then it's good to have a travel bin prepared, or basically an emergency kit prepared, and I'm going to show you how to set one of those up. The most important thing to know with travel kits is that you probably won't have a chance to go back in your house after you've already left it. So you want something that's an all-in-one, all-inclusive reptile supply and a travel bin all in one, basically. So there's two parts to this. We're going to start with the emergency travel bin, and then we'll show you how to set up an emergency supply bin and how you can put them all together in one. The first decision you have to make when preparing your travel bins, and you want these made now. If you don't have one of these made yet, make one up now so you have it on hand in case of an emergency. But if you have snakes or lizards or any reptile at all, you have to decide whether you want to use a plastic bin for its emergency travel container or a bag or a pillowcase. A lot of people with snakes will just use pillowcases or snake bags. There are benefits of these in that you can quickly put a snake in a bag and then put all those bags together in a bin and then take off. So it's great to use bags if you have large collections. However, these are not very permanent. You can't really keep a snake in here for weeks on end in case you have to evacuate your house for that long. That's why I like to recommend, if it's possible, to do a plastic bin instead of a bag, because one of these is not only more sturdy in case the bin gets jostled around, the snake inside or reptile inside should still be safe, but you can use this for several weeks on end. It's not ideal because it's not going to be the entire setup or recommended size setup for your reptile, but it will still work in a pinch for longer than a bag would. Your travel bin should be big enough for your reptile to comfortably fit inside without feeling cramped, but also not so big that you can't grab many in one go. You want them to be small so you can take it and leave with several animals at once. So this one's just labeled milk snake. These are actually my program travel bins. They double as an emergency bin for me, so you don't have to label yours. Mine just are for the programs I bring them to. But you want them to be set up with substrate already, because you don't want to be throwing substrate in here if you are trying to escape your house because of a fire. If the snake is of a reasonable size, you can include a cave in there too, but this is not necessary. That's just something that it's up to you, basically. Another thing you can have in here is the water dish, an empty water dish. You're just gonna keep it set up like this in your house near your reptile's enclosure in case of emergency. It's just gonna sit just like this. But you don't have to have a water dish in there, and I'll explain why later. If you can, you want to have one of these for every reptile that you own, although I understand that is not feasible if you have large collections. So if you have, say, 6 or fewer reptiles, have one of these ready to go for each animal. And what you're gonna do with this travel bin or all the travel bins that you have is place it in a bigger bin. Now in here is going to be an all-in-one grab-and-go bin that has everything you need. It has all of your transport bins, pre-substrated, if that's a word, and pre-loaded with all of the emergency supplies in here too. And that is its own bin of itself. At the bottom of this bin, you want the supplies. And here's what your supply bin should look like. You should have a heat mat on hand. It's also good to have some Betadine solution on hand. This is good for cleaning out wounds in case there's something that happens to your reptile in transit. It's also good to have polysporin on hand. I can't find my bottle of polysporin for this video, so I'm using old footage for it here. And this is a good reminder for me to get some. You'll also want a bottle of water. You never know if water is going to be usable after a natural disaster where you live, so having a bottle of clean water for your reptiles is essential to have on hand. You can also have, and I'd recommend both of these, have some water conditioner on hand or water dechlorinator. This is absolutely needed for amphibians, of course. I mean, I'm sure you used a chlorinator for your water anyway, or bottled water, but you don't want to pack like 18 bottles of water in this emergency bin because that'll just add a lot of unnecessary weight. So just bring this and use tap water, assuming it's safe for you, treat it with that. You'll also want some spare water dishes in here, and if you don't have water dishes in your travel bins, you want to keep them in the supplies bin instead. I have a couple extras in here on hand just in case, you never know. This is also where you're going to keep any cool or heat packs on hand. They're just going to go right in the supply bin. Heat packs are great to have in the supply bin because in an emergency, there's a good chance you won't have electricity, so definitely have some of these on hand. As well as an infrared thermometer. Not necessarily a big bulky one like this. I mean, you can definitely keep that in there if you want, but if you're tight on space for your supply bin, you can find smaller, more portable ones out there. Now, if you have extra room after packing all of these necessities in your supply bin, then I would also recommend keeping a thermostat in there. I mean, this is just going to regulate your emergency heat mat, but if you don't have room for one of these, a little trick that I've learned while traveling is you can take your heat mat and you can place it vertically along the side of the enclosure or on top so it radiates down. Then if it gets too hot, it's still not going to burn the belly of your snakes from underneath. And you can also use this if you have, say, 2 travel containers side by side. It can radiate outwards to both of them. So the thermostat is optional. Of course, you want to use a heat mat responsibly, but in the case of an emergency, those are a couple of tricks that I've found to work. You might have noticed that I don't have vitamins and minerals in here, and heat lamps and UVB lamps. Well, those aren't necessary if it's just a temporary situation. These are just the bare necessities to keep your animal alive in the case of a natural disaster. A reptile is going to be fine without UVB for a couple of weeks. It's going to be fine without a basking light as long as it has another source of heat instead. And basking lights, between the bulb and the lamp, take up a lot of space. They're a lot more bulky than just a heat mat is. Now, I'm not saying your reptile doesn't need a basking light or a UVB light or vitamins or calcium powder supplements, but in an emergency situation, your reptile can get by just by using these temporarily. Once you have your emergency supplies bin packed and ready to go, you also want it ready to go in the emergency bin. This should go on the bottom of the bin. And that's because it'll therefore be out of the way in case you need to put reptiles in it. Like if this was on top, you'd have to remove it and then put your reptiles in, and you may or may not remember to put this back. So just keep it at the bottom so it's there and ready for when you need it. Then you'll want a towel. Don't mind the holes chewed in this. Cheyenne loves chewing on towels. But you'll want a towel on top of your medical supply bin. And this comes in handy because, I mean, towels come in handy in really any situation. You'd be surprised how often you'll need a towel. But this...
Don't forget your towel.
Don't forget to bring a towel. And then on top of your towel, you're going to place all of your emergency travel bins. And if you go with the Sterilite brand from Target, do you see how beautifully these all stack up? We specifically go with Sterilite brand. Even this big blue one is Sterilite from Target just because they stack so nicely.
Make sure there's holes drilled in them because,
yeah. I wonder how much, or I wonder if Target realizes how much their plastic bins influence the reptile hobby.
That or Sterilite. I mean,
or Sterilite,
I know tons of people who use Sterilite bins for
that's true. Reptile
racks to just carrying containers. So
we use Sterilite for our rack. Yeah, for all of our racks upstairs. I forgot to mention earlier. Drill holes in all of them. We use a soldering pen, so we just literally melt holes in the sides, but you can drill them however you want, really. Once you have prepared all of your travel bins and you have them in the grab and go bin, then lay one more towel on top of everything. It's good to have another towel on hand. You never know when you'll need it in an emergency situation. And if you need to evacuate your house, I mean, first off, if you have enough time to individually put all your reptiles in their travel bins, that's great. So in some instances, you have plenty of time and you can properly package them all up. But if you don't have enough time, then you can just take your reptiles, toss them in on this towel. If you want, you can even fluff the towel a bit first so they have things to crawl under and around so they're somewhat separated from each other. But you just toss them all in on top, put the lid on, take it and go. And when you're in a safe location, you can take all the snakes back out and put them in their appropriate travel bins. Now, I wouldn't say this necessarily for cannibalistic species like king snakes. Those you might want to make the extra effort to put at least them in their travel bin. But again, if you can't, then you either have to decide before a situation like this occurs whether you want to put them in with the other snakes or maybe not include them in your to-go bin just because of their cannibalistic tendencies. What we recommend instead is just having a second emergency bin like this for cannibalistic species, so you can put them in there if you have time, or if they're your first priority, you can at least put them in safely and your other snakes separately. You can't really see it in our videos, but our emergency grab-and-go bin is actually located behind our baby snake rack. If you are in a time crunch and you have to get out of there fast, honestly, don't be afraid about mixing different species together in this pile. I actually experienced a friend having a house fire, which I know is not nearly as bad as experiencing one yourself. I can't imagine going through this. But a friend who bred ball pythons and a variety of other snakes had a house fire and he had to get out quick. And what he did was he literally just threw different species of snakes in bins like this and tossed them out the window. He was at ground level, so he kind of like pushed them out the window onto the ground, which was helpful. But the fact of the matter is he put many different species together. Carpet pythons, ball pythons, hognose snakes, Argentine boas, and they did not eat each other at all. So most of the snakes that made it into the tubs and out of the house survived, minus a couple that just had inhaled too much smoke. But the moral of the story is, yes, if you are in a pinch, you can throw different snakes together and take off with them, because that's gonna get you out quicker and therefore you will likely be safer too. Now, all of this planning and prep work is well and good, but the most important thing you can do is to have a plan. Talk with family and friends, talk with those who you live with to determine if you were to have enough time to save certain animals. I mean, obviously you and your family come first, but if you do have time to save the animals in your house, who's going to take what? Where are the emergency containers? What exits are you going to use? And how is it all going to work in a perfect world? I mean, you can plan every day and you're still not going to feel fully prepared if an emergency happens, but it'll at least help you out. So if you have animals, any animal, or if you have kids in your household and you haven't done so already, sit down, have a family meeting, and just talk about what you would do in this instance. Nobody wants to talk about it, but it is so important to have a plan in play in case an emergency happens. Now, one more thing I want to quickly mention that I forgot to earlier, but Doug's already out, so it'd be weird to have him in an earlier clip. But if you can't take all of your snakes with you and you have snake rack systems, or any enclosure really, what you can do is crack open all of those enclosures. Crack open the bins so the snakes have an escape route. In our friend's situation where he had a house fire, the snakes that were stuck in their bins that he couldn't remove all died. They all had passed away trying to keep cool in their water dishes, which was just terrible to see after the fire went out and we could go back in. We found so many snakes just dead in their water dishes. Not from burning, but from inhaling so many fumes. However, we found live snakes. After the fire was extinguished, we found live snakes amongst all of the debris, all of this burned debris in the snake room. We found them underneath the racks and just slithering around randomly in the room. We were so excited when we pulled out our first live snake, which was actually captured in this picture right here, and that gave us hope, and we found about a dozen more snakes that had lived, and those were all snakes that managed to get out of their enclosures. So if you can't take all of your reptiles with you, slightly open all their enclosures and they might find a way to survive on their own. As always, we would like to thank our Patreon supporters for backing this channel and everybody for watching our videos. And if you have further suggestions on how you can either prevent an emergency or plan for one, feel free to put them in the comments below because it'll give us something to learn and maybe others as well. Thank you everybody for watching, and we'll see you next time.